Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. This time, we're heading to Red Hook, Brooklyn, a place that's, well, kind of seen it all, you know?
Oh, yeah, definitely seen it all. And we're going to dive into all that.
From its, early days as a Lenape village to becoming this booming port, and then, all the ups and downs, artists moving in, Hurricane Sandy.
We've got historical accounts, blogs, even some chilling stories about life in Hoovervilles during the Depression.
It's wild, right? So much history packed into this one little corner of Brooklyn. So for anyone listening who's maybe thinking, Red Hook, where's that? Or why should I care? Get ready to have your mind blown.
Mind blown, for sure. And we have to start way before Brooklyn was even, well, Brooklyn. We're going all the way back to the Lenape people in their village, Merrick Viking.
Wow, so before the Dutch, before the settlers, before any of that, let's start at the beginning, way before the Dutch even got here.
Okay.
The Lenape people, they were the original inhabitants. And they had a name for this place, Hepatonga.
Hepatonga, which means high point of sandy soil.
Yeah.
And that perfectly captures the geography of Red Hook because it's this peninsula.
Yeah.
It juts right out into the upper New York Bay.
That makes sense.
And it's a good reminder that the story of Red Hook, starts long before European colonization.
Right.
It's so important to acknowledge that, right? The Lenape were here long before any European settlers, and their story is foundational to understanding Red Hook's true origins.
100%.
And it's not just about acknowledging their presence, but understanding how they lived, their connection to the land. You know, there are records from the Dutch West India Company that describe a Lenape village right here called Merechcat Viking.
Merechcat Viking.
Yeah, try saying that 3 times fast, right?
I know I'm going to butcher it, but it's an incredible name. But beyond the name, what's really fascinating is that those records actually go into some detail about the village. They had a wooden stockade, cornfields that they fertilized with fish.
It really speaks to their understanding of the environment, you know, their sustainable practices. This wasn't just a random settlement. It was a thriving community deeply connected to the land.
Yeah, it really paints a picture, doesn't it? Okay, so then fast forward a bit, 1636 rolls around and enter the Dutch. They were drawn to the area for, well, a couple of pretty obvious reasons. There was that fertile red clay soil, perfect for farming, and of course the peninsula's unique shape.
And that's where you get the name Rude Hook, right?
Exactly. Root Hook, literally Red Point, the birth of Red Hook as we know it.
It's funny, though, how that name evolved. Hook in Dutch actually meant point, not the curved hook we think of in English.
Oh, interesting.
It goes to show how the perception of the area's geography, how we even visualize it, changed over time.
Right, like the way we understand a place is constantly evolving.
Exactly. And to add another layer to that, the actual hook, the point they were referring to, was on a small island, an island that's now part of the mainland, near where Dykeman and Ferris Streets are today.
Wow, so the geography itself has changed pretty drastically.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable.
Okay, so I'm picturing these early Dutch settlers, right? They arrive, see that vibrant red soil, and think, yep, this is Red Hook. But what happened to the Lenape people once the Dutch arrived?
Tragically, the Lenape were displaced. You know, a recurring theme in, well, the history of colonization. They were first pushed across to Staten Island, then further and further away, with communities eventually ending up as far as Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and even Ontario. It's a pretty stark reminder of the impact of colonization on those indigenous populations.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. It makes you wonder just how many layers of history are often overlooked. But it is interesting that some of those early Dutch settlers left their mark on Red Hook in more, I guess, tangible ways, like with Reply Street. What's the story there?
Well, the Reply family, who were descendants of Sarah Wapelier, the first European child born in New Amsterdam, by the way, settled in Red Hook. And their name lives on in that street. It's a reminder that, you know, these early settlers weren't just abstract figures in a history book. They were real people who built lives and left legacies in this place.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
So early Dutch settlers, what were they up to? Farming? Building ships? What's the scene?
Think more farmland than factories, actually. We're talking 1636 here, and for, the next 100 years or so, Red Hook was pretty rural. Farmers, fertile soil, being close to the water.
Yeah.
You know, pretty idyllic in a way. There are even records of milling and oystering being big in the 1700s.
Wow. Let's fast forward a bit to the American Revolution. Red Hook wasn't just a quiet settlement anymore, was it?
No, not at all. That strategic location on the waterfront made it a key point during the Battle of Brooklyn. Fort Defiance was built on a small island just off the coast, and it played a pivotal role in that fight. The area's strategic location couldn't be ignored. They built Fort Defiance, and they built it fast, right on that hook, that point of land we were talking about.
Okay, so I'm picturing a fort, but this wasn't just any fort, was it?
Oh, no, not at all. This was a serious fortification. We have a map from 1780, the Sprawl map, and it shows that Fort Defiance actually had 3 redoubts with trenches connecting them.
Whoa, that's intense.
And to really grasp the scale of this thing, imagine an earthwork over 1,600 feet long covering the entire island.
That's like 5 football fields.
Exactly. That's how important Red Hook was during the Revolution.
So Red Hook was right in the thick of it. I bet that sense of strategic importance just continued to shape its development over the centuries that followed.
Absolutely. As that young nation grew, so did Red Hook.
Wow, so different from the Red Hook we know today. So when did things start to, shift away from that rural life?
Shipbuilding started taking off in the 1800s. By the mid-1800s, Red Hook was known for its dry docks and ship repair.
Ah, so it was already getting connected to the sea, even before the big boom.
Right. But then, the Erie Canal opens in 1825, connecting the Great Lakes all the way to the Atlantic. New York City becomes the hub for trade and shipping.
And Red Hook is right there, ready to go.
Perfectly positioned. So they build the Atlantic Basin and the Erie Basin to handle all these ships coming in. Red Hook becomes one of the busiest ports in the whole country. Hundreds of ships, thousands of dock workers, all different cultures. It was a 247 kind of place.
Okay, now we're starting to see that gritty Red Hook emerge, the one that still has that reputation today.
Yeah, that's when it really starts. But, of course, with all this growth comes problems, too.
Like what? Housing shortages, crime.
All of that. They had these, makeshift neighborhoods popping up, almost shanty towns, places like Slab City, overcrowding, sanitation issues. It was rough.
And I bet the nightlife was probably pretty wild, too,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, yeah. Sailortown culture was in full swing. Saloons, gambling, a bit of lawlessness. Our sources even mention guys like Al Capone having connections to Red Hook during this time.
Whoa.
A real mix of characters from all walks of life, and Red Hook was no exception.
So a real melting pot in more ways than one.
Exactly. We see African-American dock workers, Italians, Norwegians. The Norwegians even gave Red Hook a nickname, Arkansas.
Arkansas. What does that even mean?
It translates to the bitter desert.
The bitter desert. That doesn't sound very appealing.
Well, it seems they weren't exactly charmed by Red Hook. It suggests that despite the economic activity, life here in the early 20th century was pretty harsh, maybe even disillusioning.
I guess even boom times have their downsides.
That's the thing about history, right? It's never just one simple story.
And that complexity is really going to come into play as we move into the Great Depression. This bustling, diverse, and maybe slightly dangerous Red Hook, that's setting the stage for what comes next, right? And then boom, the Great Depression hits.
Devastating, absolutely devastating. Trade plummets, ships stop coming in, unemployment goes through the roof. Imagine the impact on a community that basically lived off those docks.
It's hard to even imagine. And our research mentions Tin City, a Hooverville that sprang up in Red Hook during that time.
Yeah, just families who had lost everything, living in shelters made of whatever scrap metal they could find. It really highlights how vulnerable people become when the economy tanks.
Some of the sources we looked at even mentioned people drinking this thing called smoke, some kind of poisonous drink, just to escape their reality. It's chilling.
It's really dark stuff, no doubt. But it also shows how resilient people can be. They were helping each other, forming communities, finding ways to survive even in the worst possible circumstances.
It's like that sense of community is a constant throughout Red Hook's history, huh?
For sure. It pops up again and again. And that leads us to Robert Moses and his big plans for Red Hook, especially the Red Hook houses.
Those were built during the Depression, right?
Yep. Moses sees the conditions in Tin City and thinks, we need a solution. Modern apartments, indoor plumbing, heating, a totally radical idea at the time.
So the Red Hook house is like a beacon of hope, a way to lift people out of poverty.
That was the goal. And for a lot of families, it was a big improvement. But with a lot of these big urban renewal projects, there were, unintended consequences.
What do you mean? Didn't they work out as planned?
It's complicated. The Red Hook houses were huge, the largest public housing project in the country at that time. And while they did provide housing, they also ended up isolating Red Hook even more.
So?
Well, part of it was another Moses project, the Gowanus Expressway, this massive highway cut right through Red Hook, literally separating it from the rest of Brooklyn.
So harder for residents to get jobs, access resources outside of Red Hook?
Exactly. It added to that feeling of being cut off both physically and symbolically.
So these projects that were meant to help actually ended up making things worse in some ways. That's tough.
The legacy of urban renewal is definitely a mixed bag, and the next few decades for Red Hook were rough. The shipping industry declines, crime and drugs become a big problem in the 80s and 90s.
Like Red Hook got hit with blow after blow.
It was a dark period, for sure. The murder of that principal, Patrick Daler, in '92 really shook the community. It was a reminder of how bad things had gotten, and all this happening while the rest of New York City was booming. Red Hook felt left behind.
Forgotten almost.
Yeah. But, even during those dark times, there were these little glimmers of change happening.
Okay, so maybe a little hope starting to peek through.
There were these little hints of something new coming.
Yeah, it's almost like, those tough times made space for something different, something unexpected.
Yeah.
So who are these people, these like pioneers, braving a neighborhood that honestly a lot of folks had written off?
Artists. They were drawn to the cheap rent, the big open spaces, maybe even that rebellious energy Red Hook had. This was the late 80s, early 90s, and suddenly these abandoned warehouses are turning into studios, galleries, performance spaces.
I can totally picture it, those big raw spaces just bursting with creative energy. But wasn't Red Hook still kind of dangerous back then? Weren't they nervous about, setting up shop there?
Oh, I'm sure some were. But artists are often drawn to those kind of edgy places, right? Where things are a little looser, where they can experiment and, push boundaries. And there were places like Sonny's Bar, this legendary dive that's been around since the 1800s, that became a hub for this new generation of Red Hook residents.
Sonny's. I can't believe it's been around that long. It's like a Red Hook institution.
Seriously. Talk about resilience. It survived Prohibition, the decline of the waterfront, all those tough times. It's like a perfect symbol of Red Hook's spirit, And along with Sonny's, there was the Kentler Gallery, which was already attracting artists back in the 80s, one of the oldest artist-run galleries in New York City, still going strong. These spots became anchors for this growing art community.
It's so cool how these little seeds of creativity can take root in the most unexpected places. Okay, so Red Hook's got this underground art scene happening. Was that enough to, turn things around?
It definitely started to change how people saw Red Hook.
Yeah.
But then comes 2008, and Ikea sets up shop. And that was a game changer.
Ikea. I remember when I first heard about it, it was kind of a head scratcher, Ikea and Red Hook. Didn't seem like an obvious fit.
Right. It was a big deal, lots of controversy. Some people saw it as selling out, like this big box store coming into this historically gritty, independent neighborhood. Others saw it as a lifeline, a way to bring jobs and, breathe some life back into the community.
Ah, the classic urban development dilemma.
Exactly. But there's no denying IKEA put Red Hook on the map for a whole new crowd.
Totally. Suddenly, people who would never thought about going to Red Hook are flocking there for Swedish meatballs and cheap furniture.
Exactly. And that brought attention, investment, and eventually new businesses started popping up.
So, love it or hate it, IKEA had a huge impact on Red Hook's transformation.
No doubt about it. But just as things were starting to look up, Hurricane Sandy hits in 2012, and Red Hook, being right on the water, got slammed.
I remember seeing the pictures after Sandy, the flooding.
Yeah.
It was just devastating.
It was a major setback, no question. Homes and businesses destroyed, power outages for weeks. The whole community was reeling.
But, it's like what we were talking about before, that Red Hook resilience. They didn't give up.
Nope, they didn't. And once again, it was that sense of community that really pulled them through, people helping each other clean up, rebuild, support local businesses.
So out of the wreckage of Sandy, a new chapter begins.
You got it. New restaurants, bars, shops, even those fancy condos started popping up. The art scene kept growing, and a new crowd started moving, and young professionals, families. Red Hook was becoming, kind of a hot spot.
But I bet that's also when concerns about gentrification really started to heat up, right?
It's the double-edged sword of revitalization, isn't it? As Red Hook becomes more popular, more desirable, rents go up, property values skyrocket, and those who've been there for a while start to feel the pressure. It's a story we've seen in so many neighborhoods, and it's definitely something Red Hook is still grappling with.
It's like all this history, the Lenape, the Dutch, the industry, the artists, IKEA, Sandy, it's all layered on top of each other, shaping what Red Hook is today.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so fascinating. You can see it everywhere you look. Old warehouses next to trendy cafes, working docks next to art galleries, those Red Hook houses standing tall, reminding us of this whole other era. It's a place where history is alive,
Yeah.
And it's a big part of what shapes Red Hook's culture today.
So for someone who's maybe thinking about checking out Red Hook for the first time, what would they see? What makes worth a visit?
Besides all the incredible history we've been talking about? Well, first off, you get this amazing mix of like industrial grit and artistic energy, working docks, warehouses, huge ships coming and going. But then you turn a corner and there's a cutting-edge art gallery or a craft brewery or a Michelin-starred restaurant.
It's like the old and the new are constantly in conversation with each other.
Exactly. That's what makes it so visually interesting, so unexpected. And then you've got historical landmarks like the 440 Clinton Street Mansion. It's this stunning Greek revival mansion that takes you back to when Red Hook was all farmland, and wealthy merchants built these grand homes overlooking the harbor.
And for those who are looking for something a little more, well, quirky, I know our research turned up some pretty interesting spots.
Oh yeah, Red Hook's got plenty of those. There's the Robotic Church, which used to be a Norwegian seaman's church, but now it's filled with these whimsical, moving sculptures. It's like a steampunk dream. And then there's this abandoned Boston Green Line trolley car, just tucked away on the waterfront. A little hidden gem from this failed attempt to bring streetcars back to Brooklyn.
I love that. It's like Red Hook still has these little secrets waiting to be discovered.
It really rewards exploration. And beyond the sights, there's just something about the energy in Red Hook. There's a sense of community, a DIY spirit, a feeling that anything is possible. It's like its own little world where people are making their own rules, their own path.
You're making me want to hop on the subway and head over there right now.
Of course, no exploration of Red Hook would be complete without mentioning the food.
Oh, the food. Red Hook is a foodie's paradise.
From fresh seafood to award-winning BBQ, artisanal chocolates, you name it, Red Hook's got it.
It's a reflection of the neighborhood's diversity, its connection to the waterfront, its entrepreneurial spirit.
You can find everything here, from classic New York-style pizza to innovative, globally inspired cuisine.
But we have to be real. It's not all perfect in Red Hook. What are some of the challenges the neighborhood is still facing?
Well, like we talked about earlier, gentrification is a big one. As more people discover Red Hook, the pressure on affordable housing gets worse. It's a tough balancing act, trying to encourage investment and growth without pushing out the people who make Red Hook what it is.
And transportation is still a bit of an issue, right? Getting to and from Red Hook can be an adventure in itself.
That's true. The lack of good public transportation really isolates Red Hook, makes it harder for people to get around, access jobs, all that. It also makes it a bit trickier for visitors to, really experience everything it has to offer. There's the Ikea ferry, which is fun, but beyond that, it's mainly buses and cars. As a waterfront community, Red Hook is incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal flooding. And these aren't just hypothetical threats, They're happening now. And they're only going to intensify in the years to come.
So we're not just talking about major storms like Sandy, but a slow, steady rise in sea level that could reshape the entire coastline.
Exactly. As sea levels rise, even minor storms or high tides could cause serious flooding in low-lying areas like Red Hook. And that has major implications for everything. Infrastructure, property values, public health, safety, you name it.
The Red Hook Conservancy mentioned some efforts to address this, like lead abatement in the playing fields and mitigation projects to combat flooding. So it seems like they're taking these threats seriously.
Oh, they are, and they have to. But these are complex, expensive challenges.
Right.
They require a massive coordinated effort from everyone. Local communities, city and state governments, even federal agencies.
It's a big one. So with gentrification on one side and climate change on the other, it feels like Red Hook is being squeezed from both sides. Where does it go from here? Can it hold on to its unique character while adapting to these massive forces?
I mean, that's the question, isn't it? Red Hook's future is really going to be determined by the choices that are made today by residents, policymakers, developers, everyone who cares about this remarkable place.
Choices about how to develop responsibly, how to preserve what makes Red Hook special, how to protect it from the rising tides, and I think most importantly, how to maintain that incredible sense of community that has always defined it. What makes you hopeful about the future?
Well, Red Hook has this knack for adapting and reinventing itself. It's always done that. And that, plus the people who live there, those who really care about Red Hook, that gives me a lot of hope. There's this real community activism, people who are fighting to make sure that Red Hook's future is good for everyone, not just the newcomers.
That's awesome to hear. What are some of the things these groups are focusing on?
Oh, they're tackling those big issues head on. There are organizations pushing for affordable housing, better transportation, development that's actually sustainable and respects Red Hook's history and environment. And they're also working to preserve what makes Red Hook unique, those local businesses, the artists, those community spaces that give it that special vibe.
So it's not just about fighting change, but like steering it in the right direction, making sure it's good for the people who already live there.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that more and more people are recognizing that Red Hook's biggest strength is its people. That diversity, that resilience, that's what makes it so special, and that's what's going to shape its future.
Red Hook is a testament to the power of the human spirit, the ability to adapt, to overcome, to create something beautiful out of the ashes.
It's a story that's still being written, too.
Exactly. And we want to hear from you, our listeners.
What are your favorite Red Hook spots? What are your thoughts on the neighborhood's future?
Share your stories, your insights, and help us continue this deep dive into one of Brooklyn's most fascinating neighborhoods. Until next time, keep exploring and keep discovering.